But this weekend, we've been celebrating the hard work and the music that Esther Chang has provided to this church for the past 20 years. And I have worked with Esther every single one of those 20 years. And part of what that means is that we have been in a lot of meetings together. Staff meetings, music committee meetings, concert planning meetings. And I can say that in absolutely none of those meetings has Esther ever looked at me and said, "You know, Beth, your sermon last Sunday, it was just way too short." Just never heard those words from her. So knowing that this was a special Sunday, and maybe a Sunday when a briefer message would be appreciated, I set about the work of trying to figure out what the focus of this sermon should be. And just for the record, when typed out, this sermon is 2.5 pages shorter than a typical sermon. So I turned to Esther first as my resource, and I asked her what her favorite hymn is. And she said the tune St. Clement. And so I got sort of excited about that because I've enjoyed sometimes building sermons around the stories about how a hymn was created or the story about a composer's life. So I began research on St. Clement, and I basically found absolutely nothing. There's really very little about this particular hymn, other than that it was probably composed by Clement Schofield, an Englishman who was born in 1839 and died in 1904. No other information, hard to build a sermon on that. So then I asked Esther about her favorite scripture passage, and she said she had several, but the one that she mentioned was Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." And all I could think of was that really matched the roast last night about Esther being a woman of contrast, because I'm not sure I've ever seen you sit still. Not in any of those meetings does she sit completely still, because at the least her fingers are constantly moving as if on imaginary keyboard. So I abandoned Esther as my resource. And I started to think about this entire weekend and what this weekend is about. And it's about gratitude. It's about saying thank you to Esther for the heartwarming, the beautiful, the uplifting, and the diverse music that she has offered to this church and to this congregation. And I thought about how important gratitude is, that it is important from time to time to just take a few moments and express gratitude. It makes a difference. Gratitude matters. It uplifts the person who is being thanked, and it can bring such joy to the person who practices and who expresses gratitude. There is something really important about taking those moments to say thank you to someone who has blessed your life, because it can so uplift that person. It can make them understand that the hard work they do, the talents that they bring, all of their efforts and their time have made a difference. And that can help boost someone's self-esteem. It can make them feel better about themselves. It can energize a person in order to keep going. Saying thank you can have a positive effect on the person being thanked. So I read this week a story about a humpback whale who offered a word of thanks to some divers, some rescuers. And actually, when I first read the story, I thought, this is so far-fetched, it cannot possibly be true. And yet then I read several other similar stories written by people who work on the high seas, and then I actually found film of such stories on YouTube. So I decided there must be some real truth to it. So this particular story was about a female humpback whale near the Farallon Islands, which is near the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And this humpback whale had become so ensnared, so much in a spider web of crab traps and of lines and of ropes. She could barely stay afloat. She could barely swim at all. She was really starting to panic and to tire. And so a fisherman saw what was happening to this humpback whale and called and radioed in for some help. And soon a boat of divers appeared. And so they recognized that the whale was in serious shape. She was in dire circumstances. And that the only way they were going to be able to help her was to get into the water, dive into the water, and then just painstakingly free her from each trap, from the ropes, and from the lines. But they also recognized that the work was going to be very risky because one slap of a whale's tail could cause a diver to die. But they decided to take the risk. They went into the water with their curved knives and spent hours working on this whale, painstakingly taking one rope, one line, one of the traps off of this whale, until finally she was free. And the diver said it was as if she started to do this amazing dance of joy. She was swimming and breaching, but then she came back. And to each of the divers that was still in the water, she just gently nudged them. And they said they knew she was saying thank you to them. And they talked about how wonderful it was to feel good about the work that they had done, that they had freed this whale. But it was such an incredibly moving moment when they felt her gratitude. One diver even talked about freeing the whale, her mouth. And so the whole time he was by the mouth, her eye was watching him. But the whole experience was just so uplifting for each of them. There is something just wonderful about when you experience someone saying thank you to you. So I guess sort of what I'm saying this morning is be like whales. I don't know. You know, when people ask you, what did your preacher say on Sunday, you can say, be like whales. But there is just something really wonderful about taking those moments and saying thank you to someone who has blessed your life. And there's also something so wonderful about practicing gratitude. It can bring incredible joy into your life when you act on gratitude. Some of you know that my husband, Jim, teaches a class on happiness. And one of the textbooks that he uses is called The How of Happiness by Sonia Lyubomirsky. And in that book, she talks about how the greatest single factor for joy and happiness in our lives is our DNA. We are born with a happiness disposition. 50% of our happiness comes from how we're born. We are born with it. So, for example, you might be someone who tends to be sort of plodding and pessimistic, or enthusiastic and optimistic. And it's what you're born with. It's a happiness predisposition that you're born with. Then 10% of our happiness is related to life circumstances. So you might experience a spike in happiness because something good happens in your life. You get a raise at work or a positive evaluation. You get a good grade on an exam. Even something like getting married. That might cause a spike in your happiness, but eventually you return to that happiness disposition that you were born with. But 40% of your happiness we can control. Our attitudes, our thoughts, our actions can determine our happiness. And Lyubomirsky goes on to say that there are 12 habits, 12 practices that we can engage in our life that will add to the happiness. And on the top of that list is gratitude. So when we practice gratitude, not just feel it, but when we actually express it and offer it, it can increase our own happiness. Why? Because we're not focusing on what we don't have, but instead we're being grateful for the blessings that we have in our life. So I know in the past, I've talked about keeping a blessing diary, that every day, at the end of the day, you write on a piece of paper or a piece of newsprint that you have somewhere in your home, and you write down a blessing, a moment, something you feel grateful for on that day. But I read about a TED Talk given by an Australian woman named Hayley Bartholomew, and she talked about how she had a really good life. She loved her husband, she had great, healthy, and happy kids, she had meaningful work, but she just wasn't enjoying life. So she consulted a religious figure in her life, a nun who was a friend, And the nun suggested keeping this happiness diary, this blessing diary. But what Haley decided to do instead was to take a picture every day of a moment, of something that she felt blessed about. Now, not all of us have smartphones, but an awful lot of us do. And what would it be like? How simple, just each day to take a picture of something for which you are grateful. She said the first picture she took was of a piece of pie, because her husband gave her the biggest piece of pie at dessert that night, and she was grateful, and it was a blessing. Just think if we did that each for a week or a month or a whole year. What a wonderful collage we could create. And maybe there's something for us to think about in collecting those. But there is something so wonderful about practicing gratitude, and that is something that we do so well here at church, at this church. Week after week, we gather for worship, and we do it. We express gratitude to our God for the blessings in our lives. We thank God for being faithful to us and being present each time we gather for worship. And one of the ways we do that is in music. The scripture that Kent read talked about with gratitude in our hearts, sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with gratitude to God. Victor Hugo has talked about music gives expression to that which we cannot say, but upon which we cannot remain silent. Music allows us to give expression to that gratitude to God in ways that we just can't find the words to do it. And so together with our music, under the direction of Esther, the choirs, the hymns, the bells, we give expression of gratitude to God. In a sermon about music and worship, Gregory Knox Jones said it's interesting to think about different audiences for music, that when you go to a concert, symphony or a rock band, the audience is the people out there listening to the music. He said when he goes for a run and he puts his iPod on and is running along, he's the audience, and he's hoping that the music will encourage him to keep going. But in worship, our primary audience is God. Yes, as we make music, as we listen to music, we may be uplifted, but who's the audience? It's God, lifting up our praise, our gratitude, our expressions of thanks to God. So in a few moments, at the close of the service, we're going to sing that tune, St. Clement, and we're going to raise our morning hymns. We're going to ascend them to heaven, to our loving God, an expression of gratitude. And so, Esther, thank you. Thank you for all the music that you have brought into our lives. And may we all experience the joy of saying thanks.